Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, FECCA. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, as well as everything else that goes on with public speaking. I firstly would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and acknowledge elders past, present, as well as emerging leaders. In preparing a speech of this nature, I think a lot of you can empathise with me that it can be quite hard to talk about your identity without editing yourself all the time, right? Like you're constantly editing parts of yourself amongst people, and I think a lot of this process for me has been not doing that and just being completely from the heart. So here we go, I've tried my best. And now I want to focus this closing keynote on the topic of imagination. For us, people of colour, imagination is tuning into the thoughts and dreams that are internalised within us. And it's an absolutely necessary act because it gives way to what is truthful within us. And usually, because of our very identities, it can expand a world for ourselves that may have little existing examples and can bring to life a community or a world that may not yet exist for us. So I'm going to start this session with a few questions for us to think about in this session while I'm talking today and for the subsequent Q&A. And the questions that I want to ask you is, if there were no obstacles in the way, what would your life look like, really? Not what your parents wanted for you per se, or not the things that you want to do to appease others. And if you're finding this challenging, there's a really cool tool I learnt from this life strategist, life coach named Mel Robbins. She's an American woman who's helped me tremendously in the last 18 months. And she uses this thing called a fuel gauge. And this fuel gauge is how you can determine how you respond to things in life. You know, when you're full, with your fuel gauge, you've got your empty and your full. Your empty is like when things deplete you. The full is like what makes you feel expanded, right? So the things that make you feel expansive, think about those things. For me, as you can tell from my bio, it's partying and music. It's pretty simple stuff. More recently, it's surfing, because I live on the Gold Coast now. Traveling, being with nature, making television, writing stories, and having great conversations with people, hence, you know, working on video hits and having conversations with people, and to get to know their lives more deeply. So are there dreams and thoughts that you had when you were younger, or maybe even if it was last month or last week? And can there be a way, small steps that you can make towards that becoming a reality for yourselves? And even if there are no examples of it in your life from people who might not look like you, or it's something that you could potentially work through and talk through with fellow friends or a therapist, dream it still, marinate on it, savor it. I'm doing this because this is a powerful first step, and I actually think that this is the antidote to being silenced or left in the margins from the mainstream. The mainstream that through its very structure can deny the fullness of our humanity. It's the antidote to being marginalised within our own cultural communities. This is the root of where the power lies of being BIPOC. Now, about a month ago, I spoke to Black Lives Matter DeRay McKesson at the Sydney Opera House for the Antidote Festival. And DeRay's work is largely political, but it does intersect with culture and pop culture, because although those worlds do seemingly seem opposite, they must coexist in our lives. And DeRay speaks about imagination in his book, On the Other Side of Freedom, A Case for Hope. And though focusing on a collective imagination through hope and belief, it's also applicable to my point on today on focusing on our individuality and knowing the fullness of our own humanity. He writes in his book, "If faith is our belief and our role will be better." If faith is our belief that our role will be better and hope our belief that it can be better, then imagination is what allows us to navigate between the two, to paint a picture of the future that we can one day touch, feel, bring into being. Both require a relationship to the future that is not solely reliant on the past. Both require a belief in things yet to come. We can't fight for what we can't imagine. So much of the work about bringing about a better world is rooted in seeing something else that is possible. To think about our world and what it could be and what it should be. It is easier to understand a world that has already existed. And because his work as an African American has to deal with politics, he talks about how Make America Great Again was such a powerful tool and a statement because it invokes on already existing ideas, nostalgia, things that we've already lived through and seen. Then he goes on to say, imagination is often viewed as a soft, feel-good aspect of the work of justice, but without it, we will never win. Thus, imagination isn't some sort of lofty, warm, fuzzy thing. When we put our imagination to action, it can bring about our dreams that ultimately feed into a more equitable future. We can be in spaces that we've never seen ourselves in before. It can be disruptive, it can be political, it can challenge old systems and habits, and it can topple power. But again, it always starts with us, the individual. Now, in my earlier exercise of asking you to think about the things that you are dreaming of for yourself that haven't yet been realized, I did talk about imagining life without the obstacles in the way, though we all know that the obstacles are always there. But if we keep our dreams that have come from our imaginations alive, our North Star, if you will, these obstacles seem to be the very thing that shapes the outcome or our arrival, the very things that people like DeRay are fighting for. Now, when I reflect on my own life, I know that my life has always been better or ultimately better when I've listened to my truth inside of me and not ever silenced it or put it aside. One of those things I imagined and did not silence was wanting to work in television. It's only later in life that I realized that my want to work in television was bringing me closer to my racial identity while also filling my spirit in wanting to party and listen to music. Now, in the 90s, I would religiously watch video hits on the weekends and tape music videos on VHS tapes and watch them during the week on repeat. Now, besides the South African family down the road in my suburb of Clayton, Melbourne, my brother and I were the only black kids in my family because the rest of my family were all Chinese. And the only black people that I saw besides that were African Americans on television. So a bit of backstory there. My Ghanaian dad had passed away in London when I was 7 weeks old, leaving my then 30-year-old mother with my 7-year-old brother and a 7-week-old me in London without a large family support network and the need to imagine a new future for ourselves. So my mother then migrated to Melbourne, Australia to be closer to her Chinese parents. We ended up moving into my Chinese grandparents' home, so I lived in a multi-generational home and I lived there also with 2 of my Chinese cousins. So there was a lot of love in my home and my Chinese culture was reinforced every single day, but my blackness wasn't. So TV was my portal into other worlds, other lives that I also connected with, to other parts of my identity. There was Will Smith, who played the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and my sisters who I partied with, like Lauryn Hill, Alicia Keys, Missy Elliott, TLC. And then there was Oprah Winfrey, the matriarch of television, and I would see audiences scream with delight, and I could feel the exultation all the way from Chicago to the suburbs of Clayton through my TV screen. And being a little kid watching her Oprah on the screen, one day words just fell out of my mouth and I just said, I'm going to work for you one day. I don't know why I said it, but the pull was really, really strong for me. So then by the time I got into year 12, I wanted to get into media and to live out this dream of working in media. And at the time, to get into media, you needed a score between 96 and 97. Thankfully, I got 96.85 on my VCE. Now, this came with enormous obstacle of having a lot of learning challenges. I have traits of ADD. It's really hard for me to concentrate. I find reading really difficult, but audiobooks, sweet. Thank you, Audible. So holding my attention in a classroom is like really bloody hard. And there were years where I almost failed school, and I skipped a lot of school and watched Oprah instead because of it. I just hated school. But then I figured I had to imagine myself in the state of working in media and getting ahead in life. And I figured out, in order to get good grades, I didn't necessarily require myself to be naturally smart like the other girls that were kicking butt and getting straight A's and doing all these cool things at school. What I needed to do was just get ahead of the class. So I would spend my summers reading the allocated novels for English over the summer period. And then I hired the previous ducks of the school to tutor me on pretty much every other subject and get ahead of the class with different chapters. So that's how I was able to get my 96.85. Otherwise, I would have been toast. And so once I got into my media degrees, I kept getting a sense of how competitive getting into the industry would be. And I kept being told about how hard it was for people to find jobs in media after graduating. Usually the deciding factor of whether or not people who studied media began a media career at all. So again, I imagined my future. I rethought the process and aimed instead to be a presenter and or producer in television before graduating from my university degrees. So it also required a different plan of attack. So while studying media degrees at the University of Melbourne and RMIT University, I flew myself to Sydney to do as much work experience as I could. Thankfully, I could stay at one of my Chinese cousins who now lived in Sydney's apartment, and I pretty much slept on her floor the whole time, or sometimes in a spare bed if it was available. I sent numerous letters to production houses, and I got a slew of rejection letters back. We don't accept work experience. But then I got a letter of acceptance at The Great Outdoors on Channel 7, the travel show. And I researched stories for their presenters and watched edits and TV segments from these beautiful places all around the world in a dark editing suite in Sydney. And while we did that, I also picked out, some of the backing music that would go for these travel segments. I mopped floors at Global Television Studios in North Ryde, where they would film the kids' show High Five. I followed the show's runner, who's basically if we're going to talk about hierarchies, the lowest rung person on the call sheet, the crew member on the call sheet, and followed him around to get groceries for the cast and the crew. And when producers would see how quickly I would complete all these tasks that no one really wanted to do, then I'd get invited into the writer's room and see writers pitch stories for High Five in front of a child psychologist. And then they would, the child psychologist would be able to give guiding notes as to whether or not these stories were appropriate enough and age appropriate enough for children to watch. And all this sort of stuff, all this behind the stuff seemed so exciting to me, seeing the workings of TV to make a slick 30-minute, presentation on television. At that time as well, friends suggested that I model. Now, I contacted every major modelling agency across the country because I thought, sure, why not? And I sent hard copies of my photos. Then the rejection letters came back. The line that was quite striking was, "Your look is not required." Now, this line necessarily wasn't specific to me, but of course, judging by the reaction here, when it's applied to a particular ethnicity, that's not okay. What they were really saying was, we accept all kinds of skinny white women and maybe some Sudanese women, maybe, especially as long as they're 6 foot, you know what I mean? Or taller. And maybe and I think at the time there was only one Aboriginal woman who was modelling professionally. But basically they were saying, we're not accepting your kind of blackness, your mixed race, your Afro hair, we're not accepting that because your look is not required. So, long story short, with this particular modelling side of the story, was that at the time a particular Melbourne agency was emerging, and this person that owned the agency had links to a Sydney agency that had knocked me back. And she really wanted to sign me on. and needed to also twist the arm of the Sydney agency. So the Sydney agency reluctantly signed me on. Now, within the first week, I got a text message on my Nokia phone, because we had Nokias then. How fast has technology flown, like, right? Yeah, the Nokia 350 probably. And then, and it was an open call for Bonds. So I had to go to this Bonds casting call in Surrey Hills at a particular time, like on a Wednesday, 9 a.m., right? So I go there, and I'm the only black woman in a sea of skinny white chicks. And I got ripped jeans, my tank top, my geography textbook, because I'm still studying at university in Melbourne, my iPod, just waiting there for this casting call. I go in, they take a liking to me, and then a few days later, eventually, I get the gig for Bonds. Now, to my knowledge, I was then, at that time, the first black person to be used in a Bonds campaign in their somewhat 95-year history, which is wild to me. The reason, though, was because Bonds was launching in the UK for the first time that year. So somehow, my look was required. Now, I slowly got bit parts on presenting on Channel V to doing advertisements on, low-budget TV shows. And then came the opening for Video Hits. So besides Oprah on Network 10, and Video Hits was also on Network 10, I was the only consistent black woman face presenting on network TV for 5 years in a row, doing what I loved, getting prime access and connection with living legends like Ice Cube and Alicia Keys, to pop music makers like Usher and Rihanna, and emerging talent of the time like Bruno Mars and Adele. But during the end of my time at Video Hits, a seemingly bigger truth was actually tugging at me. I had 2 dreams within 18 months of each other of being intimately close to a woman. Prior to that, I was living a straight life. I had told my then male partner that I thought I was gay, and not much was said in that moment, but that information was kept, and later, unexpectedly, it was used to shame me. Now, it would happen in little ways, before heading out to DJ for a gig, a low-key slight in front of the presence of a friend. In private, lesbian was used as a slur to diminish me. This mounted by the fact that the word lesbian had never been used positively in my life. I buckled under it, and it crushed my spirit. I even used it as a derogatory word when I was at school myself. I internalized this homophobia for another 5 years, and forgetting about those particular dreams and falling into a deep sense of depression and chronic anxiety. I was yearning for that sense of aliveness that I had in my earlier days at Video Hits. So then, subsequent years, I spent lots of time and money in therapy. And in that time, I sabotaged most career opportunities and leads because of that depression. 5 years on, at age 30, the pull towards my truth came again, only it yanked me into a full realization. I was overseas in England and became friends with a group of women who I didn't realize were gay at the time. They are what you call straight passing. And once I got to know them and their full life stories, it was like my life came into full circle. Oops, I think I dropped the clicker, but I don't need the clicker. Their stories was what I connected to. 2 of them were in a relationship, and one of the women in the relationship was part Indian Malaysian, and I had never met an Indian Malaysian gay woman before. I thought she was a unicorn. And her identity particularly spoke to me, And for me, it solidified that the dreams that I dreamt about myself all those years ago weren't just dreams. They were pointing to my truth. And being in their presence, these women's presence, that helped me to be there, to get there, I should say. Now, this is known as coming out to yourself. Then there was coming out those that were close to you, that you love, and in my particular role, coming out publicly. So my imagination took me to the spaces of what it could be like if I didn't take ownership of my own story. Being out at a time could still be something that, if not handled the right way, could be seen as something like salacious or secretive in in a society that still, derides and marginalizes the gay community. In my life, I loved my family, and in my imagination, I wanted to still be connected with them, but I had to live the fullness of my humanity and be accepted. That was my North Star to me. So I told a family member in person, first of all, and their shock really came from more of a grief of a loss of who they thought I was. And they had to struggle with reimagining what my life would be like for me, but still I was accepted by them. Now, this reaction made me rethink again of how I could approach the rest of my family. I couldn't just tell them that I was gay. I had to give them context. I had to be vulnerable and give them an opportunity for empathy to be shared. And one by one, I sent out emails to different groups of my family. My Ghanaian family in London, my Chinese family in different parts of Australia. And one by one, each group email told them who I truly was, but also in context of how difficult it had been to get to this point. Having never seen women like me in my life or on TV, merely just existing in the world. There weren't women holding hands freely like straight couples do. I told them of past attempts to come out to past boyfriends, the rejection, the bullying, the slurs of one of them. I told them the years of my depression while spending time with them, even though they didn't know. I told them about my looking forward to our routine of Sunday night roasts and playing the board game Boulder Dash, because that was the only time that I could laugh out loud and felt a sense that I was human. That was my one time in the week that, in my depression, where I felt alive again. I told them that being in their very company sometimes was the only reason that kept me going. I told them about my dreams, the women that I met in England, and how all of this had led me to my truth and a world that I fully hadn't imagined yet, and I wanted them to share that world with me. I was tired also of past reactions and holding space for other people's feelings and emotional reactions over my own. So I gave them the dignity of choice. I said words to the effect of, I understand if you don't want to associate with me anymore, but I hope that you will. But thankfully, all of them did. Every single one of them. They said that they were sorry to know how hard it had been, and if they knew that I was struggling so much, that they wished that they could have been of more help to me. Knowing that was all I needed to read. I wept over my dinner that night and got to keep the hope that I could be who I fully was in the company of my own family. I kind of want to round out this talk in honouring the people who imagine things we have not yet seen. Now, I know in this room there are things that you see that I have not yet seen, but they better our lives. All of our lives will be the better for it once it's seen into fruition. Now, this year, I finally understood in a deep, visceral sense what marriage equality means, and what campaigners and activists have fought for so long and so hard for decades, many of which risk their livelihoods and sometimes their lives. So I had played Cupid to two friends a couple of years back, Chloe and Antoinette, and after the marriage equality survey, which was awful within itself, but they got engaged, they decided to flip it and make the narrative their own. And on April this year, they held a ceremony at Stoke House in St Kilda, and they walked into the space and they stood and faced all of us during the ceremony. The symbolism of this was enormous for me. By them facing us, sharing their vows, I could see their radiance, their nerves, their emotions, and ultimately their union, their legal union. By facing us, they were telling us that this was to be shared in gratitude with the people who have helped shape their lives and given it context and meaning. My own friends on the shoulders of giants that had come before us gave me an imagination that I could not imagine for myself. I had come out, but I hadn't seriously thought of what my life would be like in its fullness after coming out. what would it be like, having a partner and falling in love and being in love and sharing love with another woman? I'm following it with action now. I can assure you I am working on it, which is great. But there is always room to imagine more for ourselves. So I just want to end this with, please keep imagining and following through on your dreams, because no one can take that away from you. And our lives are better for your imagination. Thank you.
Wonderful. Fuzzy, thank you so much for sharing that beautiful story. I think many people here are looking up to you and saying, that resonates with me.
Oh, good.
And that's, thank you so much. It takes courage to share that kind of story. And I think many people didn't realize there's so much intersectionality in your life. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that stuff with us. We've got some questions from the audience and would love for you to kind of answer them as much as you can.
Amazing.
So obviously you spoke about your background, your heritage.
Yes.
Someone asks, when and how and where did you find your people in Australia?
Yeah, that's a great question. How have I found my people in Australia? I felt like as a kid, it was a lot easier than it being an adult now. And it's because the suburb that I grew up in Melbourne was super multicultural. When you say Clayton in Victoria, lots of people turn their nose up to it because they get given ideas about crime and working class and stuff, which is so the opposite for me. Clayton was a place that was full of love. There was love in my household. There was love amongst my friends, and I felt very safe. But my particular primary school had kids from all over the globe, like Venezuela, El Salvador, Spain, and it was, as well as Italy, Greece, there was like everyone. And it was inclusive within itself. We didn't even know what racism was then as kids, it was just cool. And then, so besides that, I think growing up it's been a lot harder because the spaces that I've moved into have been less and less diverse. So I definitely hold on to my family is one of them, and now living in the digital age where, I'm constantly just staying in touch with people on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and that's how I have a sense of closeness to them. And I have just kind of different groups in different parts of the globe.
Lovely.
US, UK as well, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Since your Bonds campaign, obviously back then the media landscape was completely different to what it is today. Do you still feel there is racism in the media?
Oh, 1,000%, yeah. It's so racist.
Give us an example.
Oh my gosh, it's racism by exclusion. You watch a lot of these TV shows and you're still not seeing yourself on TV, and it's the stuff that, unfortunately, the responsibility is on our shoulders to create particular groups within the mediascape to foster more inclusive storytelling and representation. I was just thinking the other day, I have access to this, a whole sort of US television channels that I can watch as live or put onto DVR. Apparently it's legal. It's called US TV now. And it was only because I wanted to watch Mel Robbins, who I'm a fan of her new talk show. But as I was watching it, I'm just seeing so many black people on just regular television and regular commercials, selling the internet, that black families with, talking about their internet plan, or black families, or Good Morning America has Robin Roberts, another guy who was an ex-NFL star who's an anchor. And then their weather guy came in and he was black too. So there was 3 black people and 1 white person. I've never seen that before. And this is Good Morning America commercial TV. I was like, damn, this is awesome.
Fantastic, thank you. Look, we are running out of time, but just one fun question for you. If you could do one more Video Hits interview, who would it be with?
Oh, Beyonce. I haven't done her yet. She's the only one. Yeah, but it'll happen. I know this.
Fantastic.
Like Oprah. I work for Oprah, so it'll happen.
That's the attitude. Please put your hands together for Fuzzy.
Thank you.